With me today is Victoria Nourse. She is the author of In Reckless Hands, Skinner versus Oklahoma, and the Near Triumph of American Eugenics. It is a finalist for the 2009 Oklahoma Book Awards, and Nourse received her JD degree from the University of California, Berkeley. She is the Burroughs Bascom Professor of Law at the University of Wisconsin and the LQC Lamar Professor of Law at Emory University. And she lives in Wisconsin and Georgia, so you hop around a lot.
Yes, I do.
How do you find time to write?
Well, it's been a little bit difficult this past year, but I have two great institutions who know that that's my principal job, and I love to do it. When you love to do it, you do it on planes, you do it in the lounge while you're waiting to get on board, so it's both my hobby and my job, so I'm a very lucky lady.
That's great when you can do that. But this book, I'm sure, involved a fair amount of research as well as just writing.
I took my children here every summer for 5 to 6 summers. My daughter was 1. She's now 8. It really, the reason that it intrigued me was that it's a very important constitutional case for lawyers. But the case should never have happened, and it was a puzzle, and I wanted to solve the puzzle. And so I came down here and I found incredible materials at the Department of Library Archives, which just has an extraordinary collection. I call this dirty history because no one else has looked at the documents, so you get dirt on your hands. And you become intrigued by the characters involved. These are real-life people. It's a controversial subject. It happens during the 30s, inside a prison in part, and a lawyer who takes a case that no one else would take at the time, which ends up all the way in Washington in 1942. So yes, it took an enormous amount of research. I even took a year off to study genetics because eugenics connotes images that are very, very negative. Hitler, those kinds of things, and I wanted to be sure I knew exactly what was the difference between the two. I also wanted to make clear that the story of Oklahoma was the story of the beginning of it, the end, that Oklahoma is really the hero in the battle against eugenics in the United States. There are other books out talking about during the 20s when it was sort of the heyday. This is at the end during the 30s, and then when we get involved in World War II and the shadow of Hitler starts it becomes very clear that science has become politicized and racialized and that it's not really science. This case is the case that is the beginning of the end of eugenics in America, and it's by one lawyer and some prisoners in the southeastern part of Oklahoma. So it's a puzzle and it's an interesting story of redemption and struggle.
And it's something that I think not only most Oklahomans, but most citizens of this country really don't know anything about. It happened in 1942, and all we know about that is there were bombs and people were getting killed and stuff.
Right, and I think that one of the reasons I think the case took a long time, it started in the early 30s, and they tried to hire Clarence Darrow and a whole bunch of famous figures of the time. I mean, this is the day of Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde, and FDR is actually running. He's saying we need not only Social Security, but we need security against crime in 1936. This is an age where I think we have lost the sense that eugenics lasted that long. We thought, many historians thought it was a late 19th century phenomenon, and then it kind of reached its height during the progressive era, kept going through the 20s in asylums, that very few people knew that it was also happening in prisons. And during the Depression, people were looking for, they were pretty desperate, 25% unemployment rate. They were desperate to try and save money to reduce crime. And if you believe that crime is genetic, then of course this was an attempt to eradicate it. We know that that cannot be because crime is a complex set of legal categories, but at the time it was not an Oklahoma belief. It was a belief shared throughout the country. Most of the state statutes all covered sterilizing people in prison. Now, they didn't want to do it. Why? Because the prisoners would revolt, and they revolted in Oklahoma. I mean, if you know anything about how prisons work, telling people that you're going to perform an operation of whatever kind on them is going to cause enormous disruption. So wardens didn't want it. They opposed it. Departments of Corrections opposed it. So it wasn't really attempted to, it wasn't pushed in many places, but it was the law. 27 states, a majority of states in America. But in Oklahoma, the governor pushed it. And the governor pushed it, and because the governor pushed it, there was a lawsuit. And there were 3 unusual prisoners who helped bring the suit. And they tried to raise money from inside the prison. They had a protest. And as I said, Clarence Darrow declined their case, but a local lawyer named Claude Briggs, who is kind of a To Kill a Mockingbird figure. He does something that's very unpopular at the time, but I think he's afraid it's going to affect his constituents. He's also a state senator. He's the head of Senate pro tem, and he has a sort of divide with the governor over this. And he just keeps taking the case. And it takes about 8 years. And then finally, only after we're at war does it reach the Supreme Court of the United States. And the lawyers don't have enough money to even go to the argument because it's so expensive. Although they do fly at the last minute to keep the case alive. One lawyer who had also argued, he's a pretty well-known lawyer in Oklahoma who had argued another very famous Supreme Court case, was hired at the last minute to save the case from dying in the Supreme Court. And he flies to Washington at the time and saves the case at the end, last hour. And then the Oklahoma Attorney General by that time says, well, I don't know if this is a good idea anyway. So by that time, ideas had changed, and this is really a story of the transformation of the ideas about what this science really was. Was it science? Not. Hitler had made it pretty clear by then. He was using science as a racial religion. You know, if you were Jewish, we were going to...
Or a
gypsy or cat. You know, he put the Americans worried about Hitler mostly because he put Catholic and Protestants in jail first. But in any event, it was a blood religion, the Aryan blood. And so at that point, people began to understand that you might want to get politics out of this. Let's figure out what the science says and what it doesn't say. And so that's the beginning of the end, and it started here.
I particularly like your coverage of the Supreme Court decision on that, because you do talk about rights versus equality, which I think has been a point of discussion, shall we say, for about 200 years.
Yes.
In this country.
Yes, it has. This case is controversial among lawyers because the first line of it, from nowhere, announces a right to procreate. Now, notice that these are prisoners who want to have children, okay? But it has been used in lawyerly fashion for the opposite proposition in the abortion cases. I think the case was never really argued about rights, and in fact, it's led me to another book about a very famous case that it also isn't about rights, because we have a tendency to take our modern controversies, let's say about abortion, and read them back into the past, okay? And I think the case really was about equality because this was about viewing some people. The court at the time was hearing cases about the Okies, same era, 41, 42, and saying, look, this is full of prejudice. This is blood prejudice. And our country was founded on, we can have no blood aristocracy. I mean, we fought a monarchy, we fought, aristocracy. That's about blood government. And so this case, I think, is very clear that you can't have some better blood versus lesser blood. No matter what science says, you can't determine citizenship and rights based on that.
Right. Well, I want to thank you very much for being with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Victoria Nourse has been talking about her book, In Reckless Hands. You can find it at your library and your favorite bookstore.